sitja hérna, vil ekki bara sitja þannig að þið sjáu. Well, Miss Vigdís Finnbogadóttir and other distinctive guests, welcome to the City Hall of Reykjavík. I heard once a story, I don't know if it's true, but I heard the story that the City Hall of Copenhagen was built first of all the city halls in Scandinavia. It was inaugurated in 1905. In 1923, the City Hall of Stockholm was inaugurated, and it was a few square meters bigger than the City Hall of Copenhagen. Then in 1931, Oslo made a little bit bigger one. Here in Reykjavík, we inaugurated our City Hall in 1992. It might not be as big as the ones in Scandinavia, but we have a way to deal with that here in Iceland. It is probably the biggest city hall per capita. And that's our say in the big city hall competition. Enough on that. Here we are in the City Hall celebrating the 100 years of women's vote in Iceland, which we gained in June 19th, 1915. Even though we celebrate it now, there is actually no right moment for this. The first woman who voted in Iceland did so in the year of 1863, 152 years ago. Her name was Vilhelmina Lever. She ran a restaurant in Akureyri, and she fulfilled all the requirements of the Danish regulation. She paid her taxes, and she was what they called fullmyndige menn. Actually, the Icelandic word man, mother, refers both to men and women, but the Danish word does not. So she stated that she was a man and she could vote in 1863 and then again in 1866, but then they changed the regulation and made it clear that women were not part of this process. It was not until actually 1920 that women got to vote at the same age as men. In 1915, it was only women over 40 years old who could vote. But still, we celebrate today and the whole year. The city of Reykjavík has decided to stage 100 events to commemorate the 100 years, all kinds of events in cooperation with companies, NGOs, institutes, and individuals. The way of celebration is, of course, a political one. By this, we do celebrate in different fields and try to celebrate the diversity of women. The objective is to celebrate the rights that we have gained and the changes that have been made by women and through feminist actions, but also to encourage further progress in all fields. This is not all. Using this way to celebrate makes women more visible in the public field, and it's a way to put emphasis on gendered view and feminist theory in our everyday life and everyday politics. This event today is a great example of that. Here we are focusing on women and climate changes, which I'm not sure that we would have done if it would not have been for this anniversary. So, I hope that the 100 events this year will help people to get used to women and feminism in all kinds of circumstances, all kinds of politics, and gendered view in all decision-making in all fields. Today we are aiming on one field, women and climate change. We know that it will affect women in different ways from men, and women might have different view and different solutions to solve the problems ahead of us. Now we are coming to the end of my expertise, which is just fine, because here we have experts who are going to speak on the subject, and it's about time that they get the floor. First, we have a woman who is needless to introduce. A woman who has changed the world dramatically, a woman who girls and women, boys and men, all over the world have looked up to and learned from through many decades. Vigdís Finnbogadóttir is now going to tell us to listen to the women of the world. Let's start with listening to her.
Komið öll blessuð og sæl. Þetta íslenska og gamalt mál, málið sem að talað var öll Norðurlönd, Icelandic. Og I liked it when Sóley said that in the old days, not even in the old days, men and women were both called men. And the influence now to talk about maður when you are talking about karlar is very striking. It's very alien for us who remember the old language. But anyhow, distinguished guests, jeg synes det litt underligt at vi snakker sammen på engelsk. Jeg ved at man diskuterer det med her i Norden, om vi ikke skulle prøve at tale vores fælles språk, gamle, som har selvfølgelig forandret sig. Det har forandret sig gjennom seklerne. Men engelsk skal det bli, og ja, nu måste jeg berette en historie. I am a part in Copenhagen University of a new department. A new department that is trying to help universities in the world to teach other languages than English. It so happened that about 5 or 6 years ago, more 10 years ago, in England and America, they discovered that English was so widely spoken in the world that they eliminated teaching French in the universities even, and the high schools, teaching French, German, Italian, Spanish is always there because of the tourism, and also because there are so many Spanish people in America. And suddenly they realized that it's impossible to study philosophy and many of the sciences, modern sciences, without knowing the original language. In philosophy, you have to know German to study the German philosophy, and French to study Descartes, for example. So they changed their attitude and said, now we start teaching languages. What happened? 8 years had gone, and there were no teachers. No one had found it worthwhile to study languages to teach. So Copenhagen University, Københavns Universitet, is now helping the universities and the high schools in America and Great Britain to revitalize the teaching of languages. So, but English it is today. And dear guests, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be a part of your discussion on women, democracy, climate change in Nordic context. My message is short, very short, and I've been saying this for a long time. If the world can be saved, it will be done by women. It is women that will do it. And I get a smile, a bearing smile from the gentlemen in the audience until I say, but it can't be done without the help and the friendship of men. That is the core of the message. Anyhow, it is, yes, I think of my children, grandchildren. How many grandchildren do you have? When I'm traveling, I ask such a question because I'm apparently very grandmother-looking lady. So I say I have 4 daughters. Do you only have daughters? And then I can use this sentence. Yes, because I think that the women will, if they have the possibility with the friendship of men, save the world. But this will not be done, definitely, not with love or with sex, or it will be done with intellectual friendship. Intellectual friendship and discussions, and with words, because everybody wants to know how we are going to do this. Discussions, and friendship, and doing things together. That is the main thing. And of course, with an increased effort of the United Nations to keep their promises about teaching literacy in the world, teaching the world to read, and not the least women. You know that they had promised to do that by 2015, and it's not yet done. And because we know that as soon as women have taken part in literacy programs, as soon as women learn to read, their lives change completely, and they start to have confidence in themselves. Women have power. Every woman in this room knows that. Many men also. That's quite clear. Women have power if they are or can be convinced that they have power. An operation of that kind, which I'm always fond to remember, is the Women's Day off held in October, the United Nations Day on the 25th in 1975. It was then that the Icelandic women showed in a highly symbolic and material way their contribution to society. The day was prepared for over a year, and it was supposed to be a secret for the men. But of course they knew all about it, because wives whisper secrets to their husbands. What they didn't realize was the tremendous impact it was going to have. On the sunny day, the 25th of October, all over the country, women went to their bosses and asked. We called it the day off. We do not call it a strike. We call it the day off. Women went to their bosses and asked whether they could have an afternoon off, as a ladies' reunion had been organized or planned in the main square here in Reykjavík and in the villages and towns all over Iceland. A reunion with songs and discussions among friends. And being gallant chevalier, the bosses said, of course, you can go there. Yes, of course you can go. Not wanting to be, perhaps in the next day's paper, mentioned as those who had rejected ladies' wishes for only several hours off. After all, it was only the afternoon. 90% of women in Iceland refused to cook because it was general. To cook, to look after the children during that special day. And it was absolutely wonderful to follow this in the radio, where the radio, they went out to the homes and there were old skippers taking care of the home, and they said, oh, the darling left it all on the stove. They didn't know where the cups were in the kitchen. And grandmother has come to look after the babies and all that. But it was a tremendous success. It has of course, it had done this immense impact. The fish factories ceased to operate, and banks and shops were closed. All this proved what everyone already knew, but was not ready to recognize, that women are as much as men the pillars of society. This activism brought about by careful but definitely not an easy collaboration among women from all the political parties. That was rather difficult. And different organizations, it resulted in the country's largest political rally at all times. Not only that time. And it had, without deciding influence on my election as the first woman president 5 years later. Last year, I have to tell you then that when this presidential elections came around, due to this day, there were many people in this country that thought it was impossible to have a presidential election without having a woman as a candidate. So, and you don't wake up, I don't know about you, but I am not the type that wakes up and say, hello, I want to become a president one morning. So I was pushed into this because of the Women's Day. Last year marked the celebration of 40 years of Nordic cooperation in the field of gender equality. We know that countries have been in the forefront in this field. The Nordic countries have been in the forefront in this field, with each country benefiting from the experience of others, and although we share the same experience regarding the dynamic of this work, gender equality does not come about of its own accord. It doesn't rain from heaven, as many young girls think nowadays. They take it for granted. They don't realize that it's a long way, we've been going a long way. The Nordic countries are currently commemorating the centenary of women's suffrage, the time when the women first acquired the right to vote and to stand for election on the same footing as men. Political organizing on the part of women with political parties has been one of the most vital factors in promoting gender equality in our countries. And let us remember that it's also of great importance that women organize cooperation across borders. We all know who travel, let's say, in south of Europe. We are very often asked, how do you do this? How on earth have you managed to get this freedom? They have, even in Germany, the young women of Germany hesitate to have children because they have to be in the home. It's an accepted thing in Germany, not to speak about France and Italy and other countries. But I think it's surprising in modern Germany, however. We know that gender equality is an important prerequisite for economic progress and national prosperity. Studies show that women's empowerment, high labor market participation of women, and gender equality in general contribute to higher productivity, strengthen social institutions, and lays the foundation for a better future. Gender equality is simply smart economics. We forget that often. But despite progress made in important commitments to women's rights and gender equality, women and girls across the globe still suffer from violence and discrimination, regrettably also in the Nordic countries. We have seen great progress in Iceland over a short time. Of course, it has been the fruit of concerted efforts on the part of the nation, but it has also been due to contributions by individuals and groups that have had the courage to stand up for a society based on democracy and equality. The history of the women's movement in Iceland is an example of this, a history that illustrates the strength that women have when they stand together, and at the same time the great value of contributions by the individuals who have carried out amazing feats. And now there is a challenge ahead. Policies have different implications for women and men, and it is well documented that climate change affects women differently than men. This is of course because of existing inequalities. The vicious cycle is that the more women are affected negatively by climate change, the worse the inequalities get. And the inequalities get, the worse the impact becomes. This can be ironic. The vicious cycle has a devastating effect on economic and trade growth, as I mentioned before, and these problems also affect the role of women in the environmental and in disasters in business and in trade. In all these areas, the root cause of the problems is gender inequality. I find it of paramount importance to promote gender equality in negotiations and decision-making processes involving environmental issues. As things are now, women account for only 50 to 20% of delegation leaders in UN climate negotiations. I don't know whether you're aware of that. I looked it up, 50 to 20% women. All the rest is men that are looking for oil or looking for something of that kind. And women have far less influence than men in the debate over climate change because of their underrepresentation in politics and national parliaments worldwide. This also applies the Arctic Council. 100 years after women's suffrage, we are still facing large imbalance within the democratic processes where decisions that influence the life of women and men are taken. Climate change also has a gender-specific impact on men, even though men often are regarded as gender neutral. Have you noticed that? We talk about men and it's okay, it's men. But women, she's a woman. That's often said. Men often lose their job in the wake of climate-related natural disasters. Men may migrate or even abandon their families. In the Arctic region, to take an example, traditional hunter-gatherer communities have been profoundly affected by melting sea ice. The role of women in the Arctic is often not visible because of their absence in formal institutional structures. For men, the difficulties lie in making a transition from traditional activities to new forms of available employment. Ladies and gentlemen, in the context of all gender equality work, I find it particularly important to engage men and boys in the discourse on how to achieve gender equality. We cannot underestimate the role of men and boys for further progress in this field. They have a crucial role to play, and I strongly encourage all of you and us to think in a positive and constructive way about how men could be brought more actively in to help women to save the world. I wish you all every success and fruitful discussions during this importance conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vigdís. Listening to Vigdís has only been for good, and I recommend that we just do as she says. And from now on, we listen to women of the world, if we haven't started already. The next speaker is a respected professor in environment and natural resources and director of the University of the University of Iceland Arctic Initiative. The name of her talk is mitigation. All the words in this field are really difficult. We are coming to even worse word afterwards, and I'm going to talk about that then. But now I'm trying to say mitigation. She will probably say it differently. And adaptation to the climate change, transitions to low carbon Nordic societies. Brynhildur Davíðsdóttir, the floor is yours.
Vigdís and other distinguished guests, I hope I'm forgiven that I actually changed the title. So you're gonna, anyway, sorry. So essentially what I'm gonna talk to you today is essentially not just about how to transform the Nordic societies to low carbon societies, but actually remind ourselves why we should do so, and then discuss how we can do it. But what I want to begin by doing, are you going to do this for me? Okay. What I'm going to begin by doing, if you want to flip one more, thank you, is actually read something out to you. And here's some pictures of my family, my daughters, and so I'm surrounded by women all the time. But I want to read something to you, which is a beginning of a declaration made by the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and that reads as follows. Women of the world call for urgent action on climate change and sustainability solutions. We are the mothers and the grandmothers, sisters and daughters, nieces and aunts who stand together to care for all generations across our professions, affiliations, and national identities. We are the teachers, the scientists, the farmers and fishers, healers and helpers, workers and business people, writers and artists, decision makers, activists, leaders and thinkers. We work in the halls of power, the halls of faith, and the halls of our homes. We are gathering to raise our voices to advocate for an earth-respecting cultural narrative, one of restore, respect, and replenish, and to replace the narrative of domination, depletion, and destruction of nature. We are committed to a transition from a future of peril to a future of promise, to rally the women around the world to join together in action at all levels until the climate crisis is solved. Maybe we should put together sort of a declaration of Nordic women or Icelandic women that sort of follows the form that I've just briefly illustrated here. But why this commitment? Why this enormous urgency? What do we need to do? And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the IPCC most recent report that I'm sure some of you have seen, but certainly not all. So essentially, this is what we know. Warming of the climate system absolutely is undeniable. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and the oceans have warmed, the amount of snow and ice have diminished, sea level rise has increased, and ocean acidification is a fact, as we will hear about in a moment. And why is this happening? Are these simply natural fluctuations, as we sometimes hear people state? No, not according to the IPCC. Human influence on the system, climate system, is absolutely crystal clear. Anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases have increased since the pre-industrial era and now are higher than ever. And it actually, in fact, the highest in history. And despite our efforts, as you can actually see over there, and I'm sorry, I'm a professor, I can't resist bringing 2-3 graphs. Despite our efforts, greenhouse gas emissions have been larger in the most, or have increased more in the most recent decade than in the previous 3. And this is despite our attempts of trying to do something about it. So what is the outlook? You want to flip? Yep. So what is the outlook? According to the IPCC, we should try to maintain temperature changes in the vicinity of 2 degrees by 2100, and that is sort of the blue circle over there. And notice the drastic needed reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to even get close to that level. The so-called 2-degree scenario is going to require that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 72% over 1990 levels by 2050. This is drastic. Another scenario, which is the red scenario up there, that essentially is the business as usual scenario, which looks a bit frightening. Thank you. Okay. That essentially, that scenario reveals that if we continue, if we don't add any mitigation measures, in addition to what we've already done, we're going to see up to 95% increases in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This is striking, and this is with the measures we've already implemented. Okay. So, what does this mean? So if we basically are are going to get this type of increase in greenhouse gas emissions, 95% over 1990 levels by 2050, we are going to see expected temperature changes or an increase in temperatures, global atmospheric temperatures, in the range of 3.7 to 4.8 degrees over the next century. And this is going to result in very high and additional climate risks. Notice also that none of the scenarios actually are going to stop the warming. Climate change is a fact, and because of that, we're going to have to engage in both mitigation and adaptation measures. It was for the longest time that we didn't really want to admit that we needed adaptation, that we would be able to mitigate, but we can't. We're going to have to adapt as well. And what we're going to have to do in policy making is that we're going to we have to make sure that adaptation and mitigation actions actually talk to one another, that adaptation or mitigation doesn't undermine the other one, because both are necessary. So why mitigate? Why do we need to mitigate? It should be obvious. And since climate change is anyway taking place, why not just focus on adaptation rather than mitigation? Because that's kind of difficult. The mitigation part is really hard. And the reason should be obvious from what I just showed you before. If we allow the change, essentially, to take place without any additional measures, we're certainly putting natural systems and all life, basically, in jeopardy. And climate change, in fact, actually means gradual erosion of human well-being way beyond sort of what we call the headline-grabbing big events. It's a gradual erosion worldwide in human well-being, and we need to take it seriously. And why to do something about it? It's basically because we have nowhere else to go, right? There is no planet B. See? That's a fact. Vigdís mentioned a little bit the impact on women in particular. So let's take a look at just a few examples of how actually climate change affects women more those or differently, and possibly in some cases more so than men. And this is actually primarily because that women constitute the majority of the world's poor and are more dependent for their livelihood on natural resources. Natural resources that are threatened by climate change. And we can look at this from the perspective of food security and what we call gendered climate impacts or livelihood impacts. And we know that women farmers, they actually currently account for about 45 to 80% of all food production in developing countries. And this, of course, depends on the region, it differs between regions. And about 2/3 of the female labor force in developing countries, and actually more than 90% in Africa, actually, are engaged in agricultural work. And in the context of climate change, then traditional food sources become more unpredictable and scarce, and women face loss of income as well as harvests, which often is their sole source of food and income. And this is something that we need to be concerned about, obviously. Context of water, climate change also has significant impact on freshwater resources and affecting the availability of water used for domestic and productive tasks. The consequences of the increased frequency of floods and droughts are far-reaching, in particular for vulnerable groups such as women and girls that bear the burden of actually fetching group of water for their families. Few words on mobility and the impact of migration. Climate change is expected to increase the flow of both internal and cross-border human migration over the next decade. And large groups of people already have been actually displaced. And I'm not sure if you may know this, but according to the Women's Environmental Network, women actually comprise 20 million of the 26 million people estimated to have already been displaced by climate change. So climate refugees, women make up to about 80% of already occurring climate refugees, which is interesting. Thus, as women, and of course all of us here, we should take this very seriously, and we need to make acting on climate change our business. A little bit about economics. Don't leave that, okay. So We know that it is absolutely ethical for us to actually do something about climate change, okay? We know we need to do something. And actually, just to tell you, I read a recent study, a poll that was done by Reuters, and actually 66% of Americans now believe that it is actually ethical for them to, or sort of, it's a moral duty for them to act on climate change, which I thought was an interesting, very new statistic from the United States. Anyway, but if we don't really care about ethics, and we're just thinking in terms of practice, what is practical for us to do, or we only want to do whatever makes economic sense, as some of us like. Then I want to quote actually David Suzuki, who visited the University of Iceland a few years ago. And he basically stated, doing all we can to combat climate change comes with numerous co-benefits, from reducing pollution and associated healthcare costs to strengthening and diversifying the economy by shifting to renewable energy, among other measures. Meaning that essentially, regardless of climate change, the actions taken to combat climate change, they actually make economic sense. And I couldn't agree with him more. In fact, ignoring climate change might become the most expensive of all possible choices that we have in front of us. And that is something we need to consider. But what does it cost to do something about it? I just want to highlight and just look at the yellow number up there. So remember the 2-degree scenario that I mentioned earlier? To keep the increase in temperature within 2 degrees, the most recent IPCC report that came out last year, they estimate that this cost may result in, as it states up there, lower economic production of about 3.4%, these are mid-range values of course, by 2050, and up to 4.8% by 2100 relative to a particular baseline. Let's translate this into something that we actually understand. This actually means that this could be translated into a reduction in GDP growth by about 0.06% per year, okay? This essentially means that we usually often talk about expected economic growth is supposed to be about 2% per year, right? Dealing or acting on climate change would actually mean that rather than to have economic growth of 2%, we would have about a growth of about 1.94%, which, you know, may not be certainly a very large price for limiting erosion in the well-being of our planet. Shifting to the Nordic countries. So what can we do? A group of researchers with the coordination of the International Energy Agency and the Nordic Energy Research, NER, we published in 2013 a book called Nordic Energy Technologies Perspectives, Pathways to a Carbon Neutral Energy Future. And I was lucky enough to actually be part of this effort, and it's currently actually now being updated for those of you that are interested in learning more in a few months. And what we were doing there is that we were looking at if it was actually possible to transition the Nordic economies to sufficiently low carbon economies that would satisfy a role in keeping warming to 2 degrees that I had mentioned earlier. And what we did was to analyze various pathways in this context. And what we concluded, basically, were the following points. The yellow line up there is sort of a base case 4-degree scenario, warming, sort of a business as usual scenario. But what we saw was that emission reduction to adhere to the 2-degree scenario would necessitate about 70% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. And if we wanted to go for carbon neutrality in the Nordic countries, we would need to reduce emissions by 85%. And a little side note, actually, the Nordic countries, they are quite different in terms of how successful they've been in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Iceland, for example, has increased its emissions by about 27%, I believe, accounting for everything, over 1990 levels between 1990 and 2012, whereas, for example, Denmark and Sweden have managed to reduce their emissions by 20 to 25%. So there is a significant gap between the Nordic countries, how successful they've been. But what our conclusions essentially showed was that greenhouse gas mitigation is absolutely a multi-technology, multi-sector challenge. This is not news. This we knew. And there is no single solution. And here are some of the things that we showed that had to happen or must happen. Nordic electricity generation needs to be fully decarbonized by 2050, where actually wind expansion in wind technology is quite prevalent and a big part of that. To reduce emissions from industry, we need to reduce emissions from industry by 60%. And to do so, this is one of the most difficult sectors to deal with. And to do so, we need to sort of enhance or advance CCS, or carbon capture and storage activities, or the technologies that we are trying to develop to do that. We've not been too successful so far. We saw that emissions from transportation must decline by up to 90%, or 87.5 to be exact. And this must come from both limiting transport demand, we must travel less, modal shifts, shifting to different powertrains, and so on and so forth. And it's absolutely clear that immediate action must come from improved, essentially, fuel economy. Energy use associated with buildings must decline by 90%, and associated emissions as well. We also saw that energy efficiency improvements in various demand sectors, such as transportation, offers the greatest potential for energy savings at actually a negative cost, at a net benefit. We can do that at a net benefit, and this holds for Iceland as well. So a lot to be sought there. Infrastructure development certainly will set the stage for success, and that is the case here as well. In Iceland, for example, we need infrastructure for, if we're going to electrify, for example, our vehicle fleet. The government needs to start participating in that progress, essentially. Several no-regret options exist, and we identified actually many. And no-regret options, those are essentially those that, in addition to the climate benefit, that is reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, they also deliver what we call economic, social, and other environmental benefits. For example, increased biking and walking, for example, has health-related benefits. And driving a more fuel-efficient vehicle is likely to be very cost-effective. But mitigation also requires changes in behavior and more stringent policies, such as pricing carbon much more highly than we do already. Overall, the take-home message from the report was actually quite positive. Even though this seems drastic, the take-home message is very positive. We can actually do this. The technologies are there. All of this is actually possible, which may sound or be surprising to some of you. We absolutely can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the Nordic countries for us to contribute our share in limiting warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century. This certainly can be done. And it absolutely makes moral and economic sense. So just to conclude, it's interesting, I've talked about, very briefly of course, why we should act. It makes both moral and economic sense. We also know how to do it, and we've shown that the Nordic countries certainly can do this, but why don't we do more? Why haven't we moved faster? And there's a lot of really interesting research that shows that political action is not taken until some event takes place that puts the issue squarely on the political agenda. Some disaster, something really visible and tangible to act become urgent. And I think we as voters can actually create this urgency, and maybe we should. But the lack of action cannot only be blamed on politicians. We ourselves are quite complacent, and I'm certainly guilty of that. But since our actions absolutely speak louder than words, we need to step up and lead by example by our everyday actions. And we know that we can act, and we should act now. And as I started my talk, I actually would like to see maybe something like this, where we need a declaration from the women of Iceland or from the women of Nordic countries, where we call for urgent action on climate change and sustainability solutions, and actually pledge to behave in a particular way and show a good example. I don't know if that's possible, but it would be nice if we could do that. And why do we need to do that? Because there is no planet B. We don't really have a choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Brynhildur. It's quite right. Of course, we have to change our behavior dramatically. And we have to do it because of moral reasons and because of economical reasons and because of the society, but of course, there is no planet B, and so we don't have a choice. It is not just because, and it's not because we are interested in something or because we think something is better, it's just something that we must do. And now I remind you, Vigdís told us to listen to women of the world. But Brynhildur said earlier in this declaration that women have made, I think it's a great idea that women of Iceland or even women of the Nordic countries make a declaration on their own. And maybe we should think of a Nordic cooperation between the Nordic capitals on feminist, feminist act on the environment. And that is something that we can discuss for the rest of the conference. But now, the last speaker today is working on her PhD research at the Marine Research Institute of Iceland and at the University of Iceland. She is studying ocean, and now we come to the other term that I don't like in this field, acidification, and its biological consequences. The importance of the work is, of course, enormous, and we should not make jokes about this. But if we would only get rid of this term, acidification, then I think I would be very happy. But of course, also because the world needs it, the planet needs it, and we all need it. Hrönn Egilsdóttir, welcome.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the word acidification. It's a tricky subject, and there seems to be no great way of explaining ocean acidification. And there's a lot of word confusing with pHs and acidification, what's acid and what's basic, and so on and so forth. So I think just the scientific community at the time decided to use this word. Probably the best one available, I'm sad to say. So thank you for having me here. I'm truly honored to be standing here next to Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, our former president, and Brynhildur Davíðsdóttir. Both are truly role models for young women in science and policymaking, trying to make the voice heard. So I'm a PhD researcher and a marine biologist, and I've been working on ocean acidification since 2007. And I want to start with telling you a bit about that. At the time I began working on my master's thesis in 2007, there was an emerging realization within the scientific community that humans were causing ocean acidification, and it was a serious threat to marine life. The number of scientific articles published in the world, shown here on the graph next to me, on the topic of ocean acidification reflect how the scientific community acted at this time of realization. In 2006, less than 10 scientific papers were published globally on the topic of ocean acidification. Now, almost 10 years later, there's about hundreds. I can't remember if it's 500 now or so. You see, there is no wonder ocean acidification just recently emerged as a serious issue in the public eye, since only recently did the scientists themselves realize how serious this problem was. So now I want to go to the science. What is ocean acidification? So about 1/3 of the CO2 we emit into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution has been taken up by the oceans. We have actually, the oceans have actually decreased climate change due to this by taking up 30% of the CO2, but it's causing a chemical imbalance. And not to go into the chemistry, but we're seeing a decrease in pH, ocean acidification, and there's another effect, a decrease in the calcium carbonate saturation in the ocean. And I'm going to come back to that. So how does the pH affect organisms? pH is an important parameter in the biochemistry of organisms. For example, humans, we ourselves, our blood needs to stay within a very narrow range for our bodies to be able to function properly. So it's 7.35 to 7.45. If it goes beyond that range, we basically die very soon. Low pH, the marine organisms can tolerate a lot wider range in pHs, but there have been studies showing that low pH, as we're expecting by the end of the century, is going to have negative effects on many organisms. Recently, there was a study showing that clownfish, like the one shown here, they stopped avoiding their predators under low pH conditions. So they were actually swimming from their home range and into the open mouth of a predator. So this is just an example how the ecosystems, we have no idea, but the ecosystem can react to a low pH in the future in a very surprising way. So here's a graph showing ocean pH for the last 20 million years and the prediction for 2100. You can see that's an alarming rate of change we're causing in the oceans. And it's very unclear how organisms will react to this change. We have no idea if they will adapt or not, and it's probably going to depend on the organism themselves. Species differ enormously. However, this is just the pH. However, the most severe effects of increased CO2 in the oceans are likely to result from decreased saturation of calcium carbonate in the ocean. And this is because an enormous amount of organisms in the ocean produce calcium carbonate. They are calcifying. Imagine all the crabs and the krill, the shellfish, the sea urchins, calcifying algae, and not to mention the coral reefs, both here in Iceland and in the warmer seas. Coral reefs are the most biologically diverse habitats on Earth. These calcifying organisms provide all types of ecosystem services. Some of them are important as food for other organisms, such as krill, that keeps our fish stocks alive and well. And others provide ecosystem services through their three-dimensional structures, such as coral reefs, that provide habitats for other organisms. So when the saturation state for calcium carbonate decreases, it gets increasingly difficult for calcifying organisms to maintain and produce their calcium carbonate shells, or skeletons. We still have limited knowledge about how ocean acidification and decreased calcium carbonate saturation will affect ecosystems in the future, so it is of interest to look back in the Earth's history. So 250 million years ago, 95% of marine organisms went extinct. It's difficult to investigate something that happened so long ago. However, studies have shown that a relatively large proportion of calcifying organisms went extinct. And a study published just last month shows that the cause is likely ocean acidification. The fact is that it doesn't matter if you're a tree-hugging hippie or an economist dressed in a very expensive suit. Ocean acidification and climate change is a serious threat to the Earth and the economies, as Brynhildur and Vigdís both came and mentioned. And this threat needs to be addressed by our generations now. So it's interesting to be talking about ocean acidification in regard to a conference about cities. It's not like cities are in the ocean or anything. But we're facing many obstacles when trying to address climate change and ocean acidification. And our biggest obstacle is how huge and a global problem this is. We can't get our head around it, really. What we need to do is start working towards solution on much smaller scales. Small-scale solutions present models for implementing large-scale changes. Nordic capitals, cities, and towns are the perfect candidates for such models. For example, cities could implement changes related to energy harvesting, storage, and consumption. Just a small note since we are talking for the city. But now I wanted to talk a bit about women and climate change. It's not often that I get to do that. Usually I just talk about ocean acidification. So I'm thankful for living in a Nordic country, a country where the equality of men and women is greater than in any other place on earth. You see, the first thing that came to mind when I heard the topic of the session, women and climate change, were thoughts about women participating in science and policy making. The most recent IPCC reports, as Brynhildur mentioned, published last year, had the ratio of women contributors were 25%. So 75% of the contributors to this report were men. And these are people that are very influential in this field. And I want to ask a question: why is the gender ratio at the universities, where it's quite equal, not represented by this high distinguished science community? Sorry. I'm not saying that the scientific work conducted by the IPCC would be any better if the ratio was 50-50. Hopefully it would just be the same. That's a great thing about the sciences. Rather, I often think about how much female brain power is lost to climate science and science in general due to the inequality. Things are not better when it comes to policy making. The ratio of women as ministers is surprisingly low in influential countries such as in England and the US, rarely reaching 30%. The fact is that women do not have the same access to science and policy making positions as men. And behind this fact are many reasons, both social and cultural. I'm not even going to talk about the countries where women don't have education access. No, I'm thinking about where women actually on paper should have the same rights. So it's kind of like a silent inequality in the field of science, and I'm sure policymaking is quite similar. Even in countries where women and men have equal rights on paper, it doesn't necessarily mean women and men have equal rights in practice. A good example is a common dilemma of a young female working in the competitive field of science in Europe or in US, like Vigdís mentioned in, for example, Germany, France, or Italy. It's a bit better here in the Nordic countries, thankfully. In these countries, many women rightfully believe that they have to take a decision whether to have a child and a family or have a career in science. You see, a man can have both. There's a tough decision. You have worked maybe 10 years through your PhD, through your postdocs and everything, and then you have to decide, are you going to have a family or are you going to continue with your career? Personally, I know quite a few female scientists, especially in Europe and in the US, that decided not to have children because they didn't want to be forced out of science. At least they were anticipating a serious career drawback. I now understand that there's no wonder that women, that even where women have the same access to education, a gender ratio among graduate students at universities is not reflected by the gender ratio of senior faculty members working at the universities. Again, think about all that brain power and education just lost to science. Maybe we're losing some solutions to climate change because of this. So when it comes to addressing climate change and ocean acidification through science and policy making, We have to use all our resources, all of our available brain power, and therefore we need to make sure that men have equal rights to women and that women have equal rights to men. Not just on paper, but in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Hrönn. It's quite right. We need to ensure that women and men have the same rights in all fields. And I think that the people here are in very good position to make that come true. We are, here we have a lot of both specialists and elected members that have power to change. And if we decide to do so, then it should be easy. And I urge you to take that into consideration in your work in the coming years. But now we have heard the speeches from these three distinctive speakers. Can I ask you to come and sit here and answer some questions? All right. Are there some questions? Yes. Katla in the back. In Iceland, everybody knows everybody. So we have a microphone.
Hi, my name is Katla. I'm a folklorist. I just have a small, simple question. We've been hearing a lot about the negative sort of impact of climate change, and it would maybe be nice to hear a little bit about some solutions, what your ideas are about some good solutions for this big problem.
Are there some more questions? Should we take maybe one or two more, or yeah? Then you have to raise your hands. Okay, we start with this one. Brynhildur?
Sure. So basically, as I was saying in my talk, we can solve this. I'm an optimist, I guess. And there are many different ways we can do it. They differ, of course. If we look at, for example, I mean, most of the emissions are coming from, leading to climate change, are coming from the burning of fossil fuels. And the fact of the matter is that in terms of, for example, electricity generation, we have enough renewable resources to switch away from the use of coal and fossil fuels over to using renewable low-carbon energy sources to actually produce electricity. In terms of the vehicle fleet and in terms of transportation, of course, we can switch over to relying on, for example, biofuels for heavy transport and over to electrified transport for small passenger vehicles. So there are solutions everywhere. We just need to act.
Thank you. Hrönn or Vigdís, do you want to answer?
Yes, of course, we have to find solutions, and we have to be optimistic, because pessimism slows us down, and optimism makes us believe in the future, of course. I think that we have to change the attitudes of, for instance, newspapers. In all the Nordic countries, now I'm only speaking of the Nordic countries, the newspapers are full of lifestyle, more lifestyle, and very much addressed to women. How to wear your hair and how to paint your face and all that. And also, of course, to men. And have more of interesting short remarks on what's happening in the world in this sense. That's the first that comes to my mind, and of course schools. I mentioned it that I dream of a new education for men and boys to understand equal rights, to understand women and not be afraid of women. Many boys are afraid of women, and many young men are afraid of women. And the third thing is that stick to the right words. I am missing the word in Icelandic, kvennaréttindi. It's the right of the women. Kvennaréttindi, kvinnans rättighet. And we have started using the word feminism, which is another thing. Feminism in foreign countries, as in the foreign civilizations that I know of, is a rather aggressive word. A feminist is somebody who's aggressive, who wants it like this. But if you talk about women's rights and use the word and the meaning, it's understood that it is a right of the woman to be equal to the man. So words, and take good care of the words that we use, because this is the engine that brings us along, the rails, the train, the words.
Thank you, Vigdís. Hrönn.
Well, it was probably unnecessary because I guess I'm on the other side of the coin, and Brynhildur and Vigdís are probably the ones to talk to when it comes to solutions. So basically, just echoing what Brynhildur and Vigdís just said. Thank you.
All right, are there some more questions? I have one, if there is, yeah? Sarah. I would like to add one question, and you can take the two of them. If you were the mayors of the Nordic capitals, what was your first decision regarding to women and climate change? If you could take one decision. You can think about this question while you get another one. But then you have to answer. Okay.
Yes, Gita Nabavi from Stockholm, representing Feministiskt Initiativ. I have a question regarding how to include women in human rights, because human rights should cover all humans, and women are humans too. And I think it's very important to kind of widen the idea about what human rights is, instead of trying to say this is women's rights and this is men's rights. And I think it's interesting in policy making to include women in policy making, because we're all human and we're all trying to save the same planet. And I think women are integral to that goal, to that aim.
Yeah, how, yeah, Vigdís? No, yeah.
That did not go to the right person. I'm honestly not sure how to answer that question. So if somebody else wants to address it, Vigdís, or somebody else in the audience, maybe?
No, okay. I think she was asking, how can we include women's rights within the human rights field?
Is that it? Well, human right, women's right is inside the human right. And I think that it is first and foremost to raise our children, or to raise the young people, to convince the young people about the equality of the brain of the human mind. Whether it's a woman or a man, they have a very similar brain. They can, you hear these ladies who know everything about the ocean and the atmosphere and the life on Earth. And definitely, no man would have done it better than they did it. Or, yeah, I don't know, but I think so. Maybe. You raise your hand too good. I think that raising children from the very, very first year about this equality is very important. And as I mentioned before, to use the right words. Not to say, hello there, look at this sweet aunt you have there. There is your aunt, and she has the same rights, or there is your cousin, and she has the same rights, and vice versa. Not to raise girls in superficial things, nor boys, but to never forget to mention the respect that they have. And one thing that I miss very much in the schools, Mayor, you can use that idea, that is, we need philosophy. We need teaching of philosophy in all schools, in children's schools. And we don't have this here in Iceland, and I miss it so much. We have this tendency, as we have in the Nordic countries, that we like better to argue than to discuss. Discussion is very rare here in Iceland, and we have to learn to discuss, to change ideas. And if we learn that, I think that we would be somewhere on the way to equal rights.
If there are no further questions, we don't have to sit any longer. They still have to answer my question. But are there some other? Yes? Yeah, two? Okay, now we are starting.
Thank you. My name is Lars Råd from the city of Stockholm. I was just reflecting on how we are going to support and make it possible for the so-called third world to make improvement. We are making huge investments here in the Nordic countries to improve, and we really must improve our results in the environmental agenda. But we could also do a lot in the third world. There are diesel generators all over some of the countries in Africa producing all electricity, and there's a lot of sun. And what can we do to make it possible for them to make investments also? And some of them would be even more efficient than the ones we are making at the moment.
Yes. Or do you maybe want to take the other question, and then you answer everything? We take that. The woman in red has the last question.
Yes. Hi. So Brynhildur, you were talking about that changes are attainable to save by 1%, I guess, the outcome of the planet. And so I was wondering, because individuals can change their ways of production and can change their habits, but on a wider scale and with our heads of states not necessarily changing their habits, how can that improve? Because on individual scale, we're too small as one person and one person changing. It needs to be the more global idea of, I'm sorry, I'm so nervous. But yeah, it needs to be brought upon on a bigger global scale than just as one person and one person, I guess.
Thank you. Would you like to answer this? And since you said that you were nervous, I think all of us are nervous here. I'm quite nervous. I heard this saying last week: speak your mind out even though your voice shakes. And that is something we should all do. But will you please answer these 3 questions then?
I will.
Okay, 2. If you don't want to answer, then
I will start. Regarding the first one, it was regarding the third world countries, right? Well, I always think it's quite sad to look at how even Nordic countries and other countries that are, I guess, more rich keep exploiting the third world countries, keeping them in a place where this is their option, is to burn more fossil fuels, and they can't get any richer, they can't start improving. So I guess implementing some policy on limiting exploitation of their situation would be the first thing. Regarding the second question, I often think about this because it's not a personal thing. You cannot go and change the world by yourself. But again, I think the Nordic cities and the potential they have to implement all kinds of different changes can be a model for large-scale changes in the world. Definitely.
Thank you, Hrönn.
So I'm going to start with the third world question first. And there are actually within, for example, the climate regime, there are mechanisms that are actually supposed to actually help developing countries move towards more better climate solutions. One of them is called sort of what we clean development mechanism, which actually enables countries like us, Scandinavia, to actually invest in developing countries, but help at the same time with what we call technological transfer, help them with sort of investing in technologies that are going to reduce the emissions from these countries, but at the same time, which is actually not often talked about, not maybe many know, these technologies are also supposed to lead to sustainable development in these countries. I don't want to say that this mechanism has been a failure, but it's been very interesting to see where the investment is going. Most of it is going to China, actually. Almost none of it is actually going to Africa. So now, essentially, what is being done is that we're trying to set up governments are trying to set up what we call a climate fund, where transitions are going to be, or sort of developing countries are going to be helped with their transitions towards sort of more climate-friendly technologies. So there are some mechanisms in place, but we absolutely need to do much more of it, and we need to be very careful not to engage in what we call sort of climate imperialism or eco-imperialism. That is something that we need to avoid and keep in mind. Regarding individuals, we obviously, one individual is not going to do it on their own, but in Icelandic we say margt smátt gerir eitt stórt. So if we all get together and all do our small thing, things will change. And as we start to change our behaviors and we start putting pressures on our politicians, things will start to move at the state level as well. And it's going to be very interesting to see what's going to happen in Paris in December, whether actually we're going to reach a new agreement or not. But I think it's a little bit up to us to put pressure, all of us individuals, to put pressure on our leaders to actually come up with a good deal.
Thank you, Brynhildur. And then last, Vigdís, you want to?
You know, the pressure that we should put on those leaders that will meet in Paris is very important. They have to hear what the citizens of the world have to say, and they have to this day they rather ignored the voices of the world, so to speak. So I think that each of us could or should try to find a way to gather our surroundings and sending messages or whatever we can do. Schools, make the young. The young are there to be interested. To start a school in September now and let the young people in schools write a letter. Schools, a movement from the young in the world to this meeting in Paris. I think that would be not a bad idea. But that requires organization, of course. But if we ask the schools to do that, this could be a general movement in all the Nordic countries. Let's have that as a name, for instance. Now, what is the first question? I would ask if I met the mayor.
Yeah.
Wasn't we?
If you were the mayor, what would you do?
No, I thought that I should ask the question. I should ask the mayor the question. No.
Okay. He's over there. One of them. There's another one over here.
Yeah. What would I do? I would, of course, start this plan that I have for the schools if I was the mayor. But what I would ask the mayor, what the first thing I would do, of course. But I like to ask the mayor to gather a number of people, put them at a table, play chess, and ask them to, because they can't think of anything else but the chess while they are there, ask them to ask you the question, the first question that comes into their mind when they have finished the chess play. I'm sure that you would get quite a lot of a variation of ideas. But they have to rest the mind before. They can't ask their questions in emotion. It's the main thing. It mustn't be emotional. It has to be rational. That's why I thought of chess.
Thank you, Vigdís, and thank you all. I have to say that this has not only been interesting and important information that you have brought to us, but it has also been empowering, both in the sense that we know that we have no choice, we will have to do something, and then also that we can do something. And that is something that we will take with us in the next, or tomorrow, and then in the work ahead of us. Thank you all for this, what shall we say, afternoon, and there is a bus waiting for the ones of you who are going to Grand Hotel, and that bus will also collect you or go to Harpan at 19:15, 7:15. Yes. They didn't want to answer it. You will have to. I'm so sorry. You can speak to them later on. Thank you all.
Ja, goddag igen. Ja.
Gärna inbjuda dig Magnus och Maria, det är en opera, en holländsk opera.
Som kommer till Reykjavik. Ja, det låter gott, ja tack.